Ferrari just made a move that looks insane on paper. They have essentially thrown in the towel on the entire 2025 season. Not officially, of course. They would never say that out loud. But the decision coming out of Maranello right now is one of the most aggressive, high-stakes gambles Formula One has seen in years. And here's the consequence that should worry every Tifosi out there. While McLaren and Red Bull continue battling for every millisecond of lap time this season, Ferrari is willingly stepping off the gas pedal. They are choosing to lose now, on purpose. But why would any team do that? Why would Fred Vasseur, the man leading the most famous racing brand on the planet, sacrifice immediate results for something 2 years away? The answer has a name, and that name is Lewis Hamilton. And what I'm about to share with you changes everything about how you understand Ferrari's real strategy. According to internal reports circulating through the paddock, Ferrari redirected resources away from current year development as early as April of this year. Think about that timeline. April. We were barely into the season, and Ferrari had already decided that chasing wins in 2025 was less important than preparing for 2026. That is not a small decision. That is a fundamental reorganization of priorities. Now, you might be asking yourself, what makes 2026 so special? Well, the regulations resetting that year are the most radical changes this sport has seen in decades. We are talking about active aerodynamics coming back. We are talking about completely new power unit architecture. Everything the teams thought they knew about building a fast car gets thrown out the window, and Ferrari is betting everything that getting a head start on one specific component will make all the difference. That component? The suspension. Here's where it gets really interesting. Ferrari isn't just tweaking their existing suspension design. According to sources close to the team, they're completely abandoning the pull rod concepts they've used for years. Instead, they're moving to a double pushrod suspension system on both the front and rear axles. That might sound like technical jargon, but let me break down why this matters. Pull rod suspension has been Ferrari's preferred approach for several seasons. It offers certain aerodynamic benefits, particularly in how clean air flows around the side pods. But the 2026 regulations changed the game entirely. With active aerodynamics coming into play, the suspension needs to do something it has never had to do before. It needs to coordinate with movable wing elements in real time. The suspension and the aerodynamics have to talk to each other. And if those two systems are not perfectly aligned, the car becomes unpredictable at speed. That's what Fred Vasseur is trying to solve by front-loading this development. He wants the mechanical platform to be rock solid before anyone else even starts thinking seriously about 2026. And according to the timeline we're seeing, Ferrari is already months ahead of their competition on this specific front. But here's the risk, and this is a massive one. By pulling resources away from the 2025 car, Ferrari is essentially admitting they can't win this season. They looked at the gap to McLaren and Red Bull, they ran the numbers, and they decided the math did not work. Why spend millions developing a car that at best might grab a few podium finishes when you could take that same money and build a championship-winning car for next year? That logic makes sense on paper, but in practice, tell that to the fans buying tickets for Monza this year. Tell that to Charles Leclerc, who wants to win now, not in 2 years. There's a human cost to this kind of strategic decision that spreadsheets cannot capture. And yet, there is a method to the madness. Under the current budget cap regulations, teams have strict limits on how much they can spend each season. If you waste resources fighting a losing battle in the current year, you're not just losing those races, you're also losing the opportunity to invest that money into future development. Every dollar spent on a dead-end upgrade path is a dollar you cannot spend on something that might actually win you a championship. Fred Vasseur understands this better than most. He came from Alfa Romeo, where he learned to maximize every single resource. And now, at Ferrari, he's applying that same scarcity mindset to a team that historically has thrown money at problems until they went away. But those days are over. The budget cap means everyone has to make choices, and Vasseur has made his. The question everyone is asking, though, is whether Lewis Hamilton can actually deliver if Ferrari gives him the right car. Because, let's be honest, Hamilton is not getting any younger. By the time 2026 rolls around, he'll be 41 years old. That's not ancient by modern F1 standards, but it's certainly past the typical peak performance window for most drivers. But here's what the critics are missing. Hamilton's driving style has always relied heavily on front-end feel and mechanical grip. He needs the car to respond instantly to his inputs. He needs to feel exactly what the front tires are doing through every phase of a corner. And according to engineers who have worked with him, that specific requirement has been the foundation of his entire career. So how does Ferrari plan to deliver that specific front-end feel that Hamilton demands? The answer lies in what insiders are calling the intelligent flex concept, and this is where the technical side gets truly fascinating. Under the direction of Technical Director Loïc Serra, Ferrari has developed an intricate front suspension system designed to do something that sounds almost impossible. It has to pass the static FIA test during inspection while deforming in specific, controlled ways once the car reaches speed.
A simple engineering challenge, that is a nightmare of carbon fiber layering, computational analysis, and trial and error testing. Let me explain why this matters. Every F1 team has to submit their car for technical inspection before each event. The FIA runs specific tests to ensure all components comply with the regulations. If your suspension moves in ways it is not supposed to during those tests, you fail. But here's the trick. The FIA tests are static. The car is not moving when they perform them. So teams have learned to design components that behave perfectly well when stationary, but do something completely different when aerodynamic loads are applied at 200 miles per hour. This is not cheating. This is clever engineering. The regulations allow for certain amounts of flex and deformation. The teams just push those limits as far as they possibly can. And Ferrari, according to sources, is taking this philosophy to an extreme with their 2026 suspension design. The carbon fiber layering required to make this work is incredibly complex. You need the material to be stiff enough to pass inspection, but flexible enough to deform under load. And you need that deformation to happen in very specific directions and at very specific speeds. Too much flex and the car becomes unstable. Too little and you're leaving performance on the table. Perfecting this approach requires massive amounts of aerodynamic and structural analysis. Every iteration has to be simulated, tested, validated, and then simulated again. The computational resources alone are staggering, and that's why Ferrari made the decision to halt 2025 development early. They needed to free up the engineering talent and the computing power to focus entirely on these complex solutions. But here's the part that should make Mercedes and Red Bull nervous. According to reports, Ferrari is not just developing this suspension in isolation, they're integrating it with their understanding of how Hamilton drives. That means the kinematics, the geometry, the way the suspension moves through its range of travel, all of it is being tuned specifically for one driver's preferences. Now, I'm going to give you my honest opinion here. This is either going to look like genius or insanity. There's no middle ground. If Ferrari shows up in 2026 with a car that perfectly suits Hamilton's driving style while everyone else is still figuring out their suspension problems, Vasseur will look like a prophet. But if the car is unstable, or if Hamilton struggles to adapt, or if the suspension concept simply does not work as intended, then sacrificing an entire season will be remembered as one of the biggest strategic blunders in Ferrari's long history of strategic blunders. And let me be clear, Ferrari has made these kinds of bets before. Remember 2020? They sacrificed that entire season to focus on their 2022 car under the new regulations. And for a while, it looked like it worked. They won races in 2022, they were competitive, but they didn't win the championship. So the question is, what makes this different? The answer, according to team insiders, is that this time they have a much clearer technical target. The 2026 regulations are not just an evolution of what came before, they're a complete reset. Active aerodynamics alone changes the fundamental relationship between the mechanical grip of the suspension and the aerodynamic grip of the wings. Teams can't just adapt their existing concepts, they have to start from scratch. That's why Vasseur's decision to front-load suspension development makes a certain kind of logical sense. If everyone is starting from zero, the team that gets to a working solution first has a massive advantage, and by redirecting resources early, Ferrari is essentially buying time. They're giving their engineers months of additional development that other teams will not have. But here's the catch, and this is a big one. The budget cap means you can't just pour infinite money into a project. Ferrari has to stay within the same spending limits as everyone else. So by spending heavily on 2026 development now, they're reducing what they have available for later refinements. It's a trade-off. Front-load the spending to get a head start, but risk running out of money for upgrades during the season. This is where Vasseur's experience with smaller teams becomes an asset. He knows how to manage a budget, he knows where to find efficiencies, and he understands that in a cost-capped environment, timing is everything. Spending early on foundational components that will define the entire car's performance is smart. Spending late on incremental upgrades that only add a tenth of a second is wasteful. The real test will come in 2026 when we see how well the suspension integrates with the new power units, because the engine changes are just as radical as the aerodynamic ones. The new power units will have significantly more electrical power than current engines. We're talking about a nearly 50-50 split between internal combustion and electric power. That changes everything about how the car accelerates out of corners. The instant torque from an electric motor is instant. There is no waiting for the engine to spool up. When the driver hits the throttle, the power is there immediately. That instant torque puts enormous stress on the rear suspension. The mechanical forces transmitted through the tires spike much more quickly than with a traditional internal combustion engine. If your suspension is not designed to handle those forces, you will find yourself spinning out.
Get wheel spin, instability, and poor tire wear. And in a sport where races are won by tenths of a second, you cannot afford any of those problems. Ferrari's double pushrod suspension design, according to technical sources, is specifically intended to handle these higher torque loads. The pushrod configuration offers different mechanical advantages compared to the pull rod setup. It changes how forces are transmitted through the suspension components and into the chassis. And for the instant torque characteristics of the 2026 power units, the pushrod design appears to offer significant benefits. But here is where Hamilton comes back into the picture. His driving style has always been characterized by smooth, precise inputs. He does not throw the car into corners, he flows through them. He manages the tires with an almost supernatural feel for where the grip limit is. And that style requires suspension that communicates clearly and consistently. According to engineers who have worked with Hamilton throughout his career, he is unusually sensitive to how the front suspension behaves during turn-in. He needs to feel exactly when the front tires begin to lose grip. He needs the steering to load up progressively rather than suddenly, and he needs the car to respond predictably to every input he makes. This is not true of all drivers. Some prefer a sharper, more aggressive front end. Some are comfortable with more vagueness in the steering feel. But Hamilton is specific. He has very clear requirements, and Ferrari is now building an entire car around those requirements. Let me share something interesting that most fans do not know. When Hamilton first joined Mercedes in 2013, he struggled initially because the car was designed around Nico Rosberg's driving style. It took several races and significant setup changes before Hamilton felt comfortable. And even then, he was never fully happy with the car until Mercedes began designing the chassis specifically around his preferences in 2014. That experience taught Hamilton something important. He needs to be involved in the design process from the beginning. He cannot just show up and drive whatever the engineers give him. He needs to provide feedback during development so the car is built around him rather than him having to adapt to the car. Ferrari appears to have learned this lesson as well. According to sources, Hamilton has already spent significant time in Ferrari simulator. He has been providing feedback on the 2026 suspension concepts for months, and his input has directly influenced the design direction the team has taken. This level of driver involvement this early in the development cycle is unusual. Most teams wait until the car is closer to production before bringing drivers in, but Ferrari is doing things differently. They want Hamilton's fingerprints on every component that matters, and the suspension, more than any other part of the car, is where a driver's preferences have the biggest impact. Now, I want to address the elephant in the room. Ferrari has a history of making bold technical bets that do not pay off. Remember the double floor concept from a few years ago? Or the radical side pod design that everyone copied but Ferrari themselves abandoned? The team has a pattern of swinging for the fences and striking out. So what makes this time different? According to people inside Maranello, the difference is the regulatory reset. In previous years, Ferrari was trying to out-innovate teams that had established working concepts. They were playing catch-up while also trying to be clever. But in 2026, everyone starts from zero. The playing field is level, and that changes the risk-reward calculation entirely. When everyone is starting from scratch, being bold is actually less risky than playing it safe, because if you play safe and your conservative design is only average, you have no path to winning. But if you take a risk and it pays off, you could dominate. and in a cost-capped era, you might never catch up. Vasseur understands this math. He knows that the 2026 championship will likely be decided by which team makes the best technical choices in these early development years. The team that nails the suspension and the power unit integration will have an advantage that could last for multiple seasons, and that is worth sacrificing a few races in 2025. Let me take you deeper into the specific technical differences between what Ferrari was doing before and what they are building now, because understanding these details is the only way to appreciate the scale of what Vasseur is attempting. The pull rod suspension that Ferrari has used in recent years has certain aerodynamic benefits. By mounting the suspension elements in tension rather than compression, the team could clean up the airflow around the side pods. The components could be packaged more tightly. The overall aerodynamic efficiency of the car improved. But pull rod suspension has drawbacks as well. The forces transmitted through the system are different. The way the suspension reacts to bumps and curbs is different. And critically for Ferrari's 2026 plans, the ability to control the car's ride height under aerodynamic loading is more limited. The double pushrod system Ferrari is developing for 2026 addresses these drawbacks. By putting suspension elements in compression rather than tension, the team gains more control over how the car behaves under heavy aerodynamic loading. The suspension can be stiffer in specific directions while remaining compliant in others, and the geometry can be optimized for the active aerodynamics that will define the 2026 regulations. But here is the challenge. Switching from pull rod to push rod is not like changing a bolt. It requires redesigning the entire front end of the car. The chassis mounting points are different. The cooling packaging has to change. Even the steering geometry is affected. This is a fundamental change to the car's architecture, not a minor tweak. That's why front-loading this development is so important. Ferrari can't just decide 6 months before the 2026 season to switch suspension concepts. They need years of development time.
Get it right. Every iteration has to be simulated, tested, and validated. The carbon fiber layering for the intelligent flex concept alone requires months of analysis. According to technical sources, Ferrari has already gone through multiple design iterations of the 2026 suspension. Each iteration has been tested in simulation and then refined based on the results, and Hamilton's feedback has been incorporated at every stage. The team is not just building a fast car, they are building a car specifically designed for one driver's unique requirements. This level of customization is rare in modern Formula One. Most cars are designed to be drivable by either of the team's 2 drivers, with setup changes used to accommodate individual preferences. But Ferrari is taking a different approach. They are designing the car around Hamilton first, and then seeing if Leclerc can adapt. That choice carries its own risks. Leclerc is an incredibly talented driver, but his style is different from Hamilton's. He tends to be more aggressive on corner entry. He rotates the car more with the rear. If the 2026 Ferrari is built entirely around Hamilton's preferences, Leclerc might struggle to extract the same performance. But here's my take on that situation. Ferrari has decided that Hamilton is their best chance to win a championship, and they are acting accordingly. They're not trying to build a car that works equally well for both drivers. They're building a car that maximizes Hamilton's chances, and if Leclerc can adapt, great. If not, that's a problem for another day. This might sound cold, but this is how top teams operate. You allocate your resources where they will have the biggest impact. And right now, that means focusing on the 7-time champion who joined your team specifically because he believed you could build him a winning car. Now, let me address something that does not get talked about enough. The budget cap is not the only limitation Ferrari is facing. There are also aerodynamic testing restrictions that limit how many wind tunnel hours and computational fluid dynamics runs a team can perform. These restrictions are tiered based on championship position. The better you finish, the less testing time you get. This creates an interesting dynamic for Ferrari in 2025. By sacrificing performance now, they might actually position themselves for more development time on the 2026 car. If they finish lower in the Constructors' Championship this season, they will get additional wind tunnel and CFD allocations for next year. That could accelerate their 2026 development even further.
Now, I'm not suggesting Ferrari is deliberately trying to lose. That would violate the spirit of the competition and wouldn't sit well with anyone in the organization. But the reality is that if you're not going to win the championship anyway, there's a strategic benefit to finishing 5th rather than 3rd. You get more development resources for the following year. This is the kind of gamesmanship that the regulations have accidentally created. The intent of the sliding scale testing restrictions was to help the weaker teams catch up, but smart teams have realized that finishing slightly worse than your maximum potential can actually help you in the long run if the regulations are changing dramatically. Vasseur is too smart to admit this publicly, and honestly, I don't think Ferrari is throwing races on purpose, but I do think they're less motivated to push for every last point when those points might cost them development time for 2026. It's a subtle shift in priorities, but it has real consequences for how aggressively they develop the current car. Let me bring this all together and explain what I think Ferrari's real strategy is here, because if you've been paying attention, you'll notice that this isn't just about suspension design. This is about something much bigger. Ferrari is attempting to redefine how Formula One cars are developed. Instead of the traditional approach where teams build a car and then try to adapt it to their drivers, Ferrari is starting with the driver and building the car around him. Hamilton's preferences are not input to the design process, they are the design process. This approach has been tried before, but never with this level of commitment. Usually, teams talk about building the car around the driver while actually building the car around what the engineers think is fastest. But according to the reports coming out of Maranello, Vasseur has given Hamilton unprecedented influence over the 2026 car's development. The intelligent flex suspension concept, the switch to double pushrod, the decision to front-load development resources, all of it traces back to Hamilton's specific requirements. The team is not asking what the fastest theoretical suspension might be. They are asking what suspension gives Hamilton the feeling he needs to drive at his best. This is a bet on Hamilton's ability to translate feel into speed, and historically, that bet has paid off. Every team Hamilton has driven for has eventually learned that giving him what he wants in terms of car behavior produces results that data alone cannot predict. He has an intuition for finding time that defies conventional engineering analysis. But here's the risk that keeps me up at night if I'm a Ferrari fan. Hamilton is 40 years old. By the time the 2026 season starts, he'll be 41. Father Time is undefeated in professional sports. Even the greatest athletes eventually lose that extra tenth of a second that separates champions from everyone else. Ferrari is betting that Hamilton's decline has not started yet, or if it has started, that the advantage of having a car perfectly tailored to his style will outweigh any age-related loss of performance. That's a reasonable bet, but it's still a bet, and in Formula One, reasonable bets fail all the time. The other risk is that Ferrari's competitors are not standing still. Mercedes, Red Bull, McLaren, they all have brilliant engineers too. They all know what the 2026 regulations require, and they're all developing their own solutions. Just because Ferrari is front-loading their suspension development doesn't mean they'll end up with the best suspension. In fact, there's an argument that front-loading development too early is actually a disadvantage. The regulations are still being finalized. Small changes could invalidate months of work. By starting too early, Ferrari might have locked themselves into a design direction that becomes suboptimal when the final rules are published. According to sources, Ferrari is confident that the core suspension regulations are stable enough to design around, but the FIA has been known to make late changes before, and if they change something fundamental about how active aerodynamics interacts with suspension geometry, Ferrari could be forced to start over. That would be a disaster. They would have sacrificed the 2025 season for nothing. They would have wasted months of development time and millions of dollars. And they would enter the 2026 season behind teams that waited for clearer rules before committing to their designs. But Vasseur is not worried about this possibility, and people who have worked with him say he's not a gambler by nature. He's a calculated risk-taker. He makes decisions based on the information available at the time. And right now, the information suggests that getting a head start on suspension development is the highest leverage move he can make. My personal opinion, and I want to be clear that this is just my analysis, is that Vasseur is making the right call. The 2026 regulations are so different from what came before that any team not already deep in development is going to struggle. Ferrari may have started earlier than everyone else, but that is not a mistake. That's an advantage. The real question is execution. Ferrari has had great concepts before that failed in implementation. The team has a history of brilliant ideas that never quite worked on track. Will the intelligent flex suspension actually perform as designed? Will the double pushrod geometry deliver the stability Hamilton needs? Will the integration with the new power units be seamless? We won't know the answers to these questions until 2026, but one thing is certain: Ferrari has made their choice. They are all in on 2026. They are all in on Lewis Hamilton, and they are all in on a suspension concept that could either win them a championship or set them back for years. That's the story of Ferrari. High risk, high reward. Brilliance or disaster. There's never a boring moment with this team, and whatever happens in 2026, we will be watching.